Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Chapter 43 Work Group presentation. I'm John Thompson. I am the Director of the Indian Hip Federated Library System. I am also the PLSR Steering Committee Chair and liaison to the Chapter 43 Work Group. Walter Burkholter from Fontana Public Library, Marla Stepnowski from Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and John DeBacher are part of our presentation team. John is the DPI liaison to the project.
So I'm supposed to introduce members of the work group. So we've already got 4 of them, and we're the only ones here, so I'm not certain who I'm supposed to introduce. So maybe we should just move back to you again, John.
How many of you were in other sessions regarding PLSR? Everybody. So this is going to be a little bit different of a presentation. We're one of the groups that really is an information source for the steering committee. So we're not going to be able to answer all these questions up here, but one of the things that we're going to want from you during feedback and questions is if there are things that as a committee or work group, that we're missing in part of the research that we're doing for this structure. So we're going to try to keep things rolling here. The outcomes, like I mentioned, we're one of those groups that will be feeding into the steering committee, along with the principles of structure document and all the other pieces that we've already seen in all the slides. This group is really the research arm for the steering committee to help provide information and context for a lot of different things.
Boy, we'll be done in 10 minutes, I can tell. No, we haven't gotten to John yet. Yeah, that'll take a few hours. Anyway, my slide is to talk about the research that we've done so far or will be doing in the future. We have done a review of Chapter 43, which seems rather obvious, but we've also benefited from commentary and historical perspective from both Peter Hammond and John DeBacher. We also went through a review of states to see what their statutes contained. That helped us provide a framework for discussion, and we've hopefully we'll be talking with other with legislative and other governmental stakeholders. Some of the peer states that we had in our review included Minnesota. I don't know why Illinois is on here because they weren't too cooperative. Ohio, Texas, and a few others. In addition, the work group, reviewed selected states based on the knowledge of committee members and liaisons recommendations from the library community and knowledge of division staff. So we also included Colorado, Massachusetts, New York, I already mentioned Texas, and others. Part of our investigation included calling them on the phone, discussing things with individual states. Some of the ones that were more productive than others had a state librarian, at least for me, that was really productive. We are also going to be having discussions with individuals who once worked in Wisconsin or other states. And for all of this, you can go to the, anyone? Our resource pages, which has recordings of calls with a number of other states. And now I have to pass the microphone to John DeBacher. 3 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Well, it says brief history. Yes, they discouraged me from talking about the history of recorded information, cuneiform, pictographs, development of movable type. But Ben Franklin had the first public library in Boston. Anyway, library systems were created for me, really. I was born in 1956, the first year of the Library Services Act, and a few years later, Wisconsin used funds from that to develop predecessors of the current systems in Southwest Wisconsin, Northern Waters, reference center services in Marathon County through at that time the Wausau Public Library, and there were some services then funded in what's now the Winnifox system for technology services. But there was, when the Free Library Commission was decommissioned in 1965 and moved library development to public instruction, awareness that there were still over 800,000 people in the state of Wisconsin that didn't have direct library services. They didn't have a library they could go to and use. That led to the development and the introduction, or the passing in 1971 of the bill that created provisions for library systems with counties as the building block. Some other bill changes through the next couple of decades made some changes in some of the administration and services of the library, but not much substantially in what they do. And I think that was some of what has been identified through previous studies in 2002 by systems, or 2000 by systems themselves, 2002 through the task force, and 2013 by SIRLAW, the System and Resource Library Administration's Association of Wisconsin. Did I get that right? They all indicated updates that should be made and some shortcomings of how systems were working in Wisconsin. The legislature then tried to get the Department of Administration to do a lean study. Thankfully, the governor vetoed that, acknowledging the DPI has that authority, and we did do a study in 2014. COLAN, the Council on Library and Network Development, followed up developing a roadmap in conjunction with some of the members of that lead study that directly led to our requesting the superintendent to appoint a steering committee for this process. So I went a little too beyond that and probably beyond my 3 minutes, but that's the history of it. Woo-hoo. So I was born when it started, and this will kill me.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of numbers up there, and those statute references all relate to the various pieces within Chapter 43 that relate to library systems in some way. Some of them talk about how you join a system, how you can leave a system, how systems can merge, the board structures of systems, what are required system services, and how the systems are funded. So there are a lot of places within the statute that library systems are covered. Our focus of the work group and of the PLSR process are related to the statutes that directly relate to library systems. Some of the things that we are not covering as part of this process and project that have been brought up as part of the conversations, we are not looking at county funding for libraries. We are not looking at public library standards for the public libraries, nor are we looking at director certification. All of those fall outside of the charge of the steering committee, and in some cases they are being addressed by other groups. So the Department of Public Instruction is working on a new set of public library standards, and other pieces related to county library funding are regional issues, and those are best addressed locally and are being talked about by the Library Development and Legislative Committee of WLA. They are working very hard on that advocacy piece. Okay, so we've all been discussing equity as part of this process. And Chapter 43 work group is a little different. We're not looking at service equity within our group. We're going to be focusing on if changes are needed to be made to Chapter 43, are they going to be able to address those equity issues? So are we going to allow for future flexibility? Are we going to allow for innovation? Does it support feedback on the services from the individuals receiving those services? Does it remove barriers? And does it support equity for libraries and services? So we're really kind of focusing on that piece for the equity piece when we're looking at Chapter 43. So one of the things we're doing is kind of providing a framework for the steering committee about library systems today. And some of the issues that we've been looking at is, systems are different in Wisconsin. They grew up organically, there was no planning. So we have a map. We have 16 systems that are all various different sizes, different regions, and all kinds of different things. And we are trying to make sure that everybody kind of has a sense of what library systems are. Many of the folks, especially my system, have never worked in another library system in Wisconsin, so they're not necessarily sure what another system in our state looks like. So we've been trying to put some of that information together as well. So we've got systems in the state of Wisconsin that are as small as 1 county with 2 libraries, to as large as 10 counties and 53 libraries, or 7 counties and 54 libraries. So there's a huge range of how the systems are designed in the state. And we're ranging from less than 1,000 square miles to over 7,000 square miles in system boundaries. So there's a lot of different variation in that, and there's variation in funding. So there's a lot of pieces that we have to consider when we're looking at the regions and different things like that. That this is what the map looks like today, what it looks like going forward, we'll see what that is. And now I'm going to turn it back over to John for a chat about the required system services.
Thank you, John. So this lists out, and you'll notice that there's a lot of parallel between these carroted items and the work groups that were created to look into the services. That's what the lean group focused on. I mean, we really had to start with what the statutes require today. And some of the, some of what I could focus on, I talked about already, the lean study, the Law report, trying to create improvements, and that's a lot what we're trying to look at is how much are our constituents aware of these different services, how relevant are these? I mean, chapter 43 isn't so much, but that's the task of the steering group and the work groups. How do these fit with the overlay and the picture of public libraries today and what regionalized support could do for them? Oh, hi, I'm John. So where we're at now, one of the things that we decided to do while we got tired of playing cards, so while the other work groups were working, we took it upon ourselves and were asked to look at what other states are doing to support their public libraries through regionalized services, or had supported their state through regionalized services. And we've listed many of the states that were identified as having regional services and or having had regionalized services. I mean, there's some other one, Texas, for instance. Their funding was sharply declined, and the state library then used federal money to support that, and then the state library's money was sharply cut, and so they had to sharply reduce that, and really the systems have pretty much faded away in Texas. But we'll cover some of these. Colorado, for instance, Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in 2002 eliminated them, and they then had to, through other reduced state services, there had to be a referendum to restore some support for libraries in the state, and they created CLIC, a statewide, essentially library system that provides some of those services. These are some of the insights that we've developed from the other states. I hope you can read some of these. Some of this has come up in a little bit in some of the other topic groups, but a lot of it has been just changes in this new century and a different kind of political context that has caused many states, to be more concerned with tax money and funding. So there's been a sharp reduction or elimination. We've seen what happened in Illinois. We looked at that. In Michigan, the money has just declined and declined and declined as their economy has suffered. So it just, I guess, to give us ourselves, to kind of pump ourselves up or give us some credit, in relative to other states, the amount of funding for regional support for public libraries is not insubstantial in Wisconsin. It's been reduced as some of that's been restored, but aside from some really large states like California or New York, where there's a lot of population and a lot of tax money available, we're not doing too bad, but we need to try and prevent what's happened in some other states. Few other states, I should have changed that to few, have resource libraries. The last session talked about that. Even some of the states that have them aren't aware of them. When I talked to the State Library of Maryland, they said, well, most of those systems, that's just kind of, we have the Pratt library in Baltimore, but not much in the other areas. Most other states too, well, eventually the steering committee will have to look at governance, but the governing structures in other states almost always are primarily comprised of libraries, so of members of libraries, and here it's all appointed by counties. So, who do I share with now?
You have Minnesota, John.
Oh, okay. Okay. One of the states, because of our proximity, and we've got many similarities. I looked at the statute language in the structure of Minnesota. We also now have some moles there, since several of our system directors have gone over to operate a couple of the different types of system structures in Minnesota. Minnesota's their financial support for systems is also fairly substantial, but they've got three different types of systems really. Multi-type structures that cover not just public libraries, but also academic and school libraries. And some of these overlap, and then they've got public library systems that are federated like ours, where all of ours are federated. Independent libraries are operated by their own library boards, and then they belong to this, league of libraries that, is their system. In Minnesota, they have we have a provision in our statutes, but none exist. Well, we don't even have a provision for multi-county consolidated library systems, where the system has governance authority over all the libraries, and that's in more remote parts of the state, where it's predominantly smaller libraries, or where there would be county libraries, but the system has this main umbrella support, and then they have sort of advisory boards at the local level and some additional support at local level by municipalities. That was intriguing, but also confounding to me, and that would be interesting to find out more.
Hi everyone. I was charged with researching the library structure in the state of Ohio. It's kind of interesting. Ohio has 251 public libraries in almost 500 locations, but in Ohio, public libraries are called public library systems. So it can get kind of confusing when we're thinking about comparisons with Wisconsin. There is a state library of Ohio that supports the information and resource sharing network of public library systems. And the State Library of Ohio is governed by a state library board. The 5 members of the board are appointed by the State Department of Education. They serve 5 years. One of the major responsibilities of the State Library Board is to appoint a state librarian. There are a number of ways in which the state library and state funds are used to support public library systems. I just want to note a few of them. There is a program called Serving Every Ohioan, which is SEO. It's a consortium of 93 small and rural library systems in 225 physical locations across 46 counties in Ohio. State funds and the state library also supports a program called Ohio Library Share More, which is moving Ohio resources everywhere, which connects mostly the urban ILS catalogs with each other and also with CO. There's an agency called OPLIN, which is Ohio Public Library Information's Network, which does support telecommunications and technology on behalf of the public library systems. So it's really through those three projects that resources from every public library system are made available to citizens of Ohio. The state of Ohio also provides funds for the state delivery system, for the Ohio Web Library, which makes thousands of digital publications and research materials available to Ohio libraries, schools, universities, and citizens at absolutely no cost. And they also subsidize something similar to what we have through our digital buying pool, which provides downloadable ebooks and digital content to library patrons. Last but not least, which something that was more important to me, was Ohio supports 4 regional library systems. They have downsized. And the regional library systems are broken out into the 4 quadrants of the state. They each receive equal amounts of money from the state. They are I would say they're a multi-type organization that is membership driven. Their primary responsibility is to provide continuing education and training to library staffs in academic, school, special, and public libraries. They also provide some consulting and technology support, but if additional services are expected or asked for, it comes at a cost.
And interestingly, yes, many of those services are funded at the state level and affect some of the libraries, but the appropriation for 2018 for the 4 quadrants in Ohio for whatever, operating, overhead, staffing, is $67,000 each, and that's down from about $150,000 each 4 years ago when I first started talking to them. So they're struggling for those kind of that a lot of the services require participation of the member libraries. I'm just going to add a little bit about Colorado. The break fund, there's a interesting funding component of this too. The funds supporting the state library, 36% are federal funds that the state library reappropriates to the CLIC, the system support. So that's 36% of their support. 64% is from state sales tax. Ohio, interestingly, has direct support of its public libraries through a sales tax structure. But that's been, reduced some in recent years. Of the 64% of the state funds, all but 18% is a pass-through for grants. So they're targeted, the services that CLIC is supposed to provide. At the same time, the state library does have a lot of reliance on CLIC and a good partnership for some of the statewide programs that they've developed, and even some of them they've taken nationally, and they really rely on them for many procurement duties that otherwise would be restricted at the state library to state procurement, whereas CLIC has more latitude, and I believe that's the case for Massachusetts as well. All right, I'm going to let Walter add some more specific information on the demise and what's left in Texas.
As John so aptly put it, there's not much left as far as library systems in Texas. In 2001, the state significantly cut funding to library services. So actually right now, they still have library systems in the state statutes, but they're going to be changing that because they realize there's never going to be funding returning to those agencies again. And so the agency that took over several of the actions as a result of these cuts They eliminated a lot of FTE positions and merged the library-focused divisions to create what is the new Library Development and Networking Division within the state library, which, when I talk to the state librarian, is extremely small. They have a couple of consultants that run these, and as you can imagine, Texas is a large state with quite a few public libraries, and he feels really bad about it, but there's not much he can do. They also eliminated the Lone Star Libraries Grant Program, which was direct assistance to public libraries in Texas. And of course, they eliminated the 10 regional library systems. The state library is the only organization providing collaborative library services through the Texas Library Association, which provides coordination with K-12 schools. The primary service is called TechShare, which provides access to online resources. It also offers an interlibrary loan card that may be used in participating libraries. That sounds really good, but the reality is that most public libraries do not participate in that. The ones that do are urban libraries, which is great for those libraries, but it's not a huge program in Texas. The state library is an independent state agency. It's governed by a 7-member commission that's appointed by the governor. Though that 7-member commission appoints the state librarian, and he or she, it's currently a he, administers the agency, and like I said, is appointed by the commission. The budget of the state library is approximately $28 million. 14 million, it's about half and half. $14 million of that is through state taxation. A significant portion of it is LSTA, and then they have their interlibrary loan and cataloging service, which they charge for. So it's a self-sustaining project, so they don't have to worry about getting tax dollars for that. I think one of the things that's interesting, not only about Texas, but a number of the states that we looked at, is that they have a state library. That's something that we don't have here in Wisconsin. I don't think that's going to happen as a result of this process, but I think it's worth noting because it really is different. You know, when they eliminated when they eliminated the library systems in Illinois, when they eliminated the library systems in Texas, the library services primarily fell on the state library, which already existed. So it's not something that we could envision happening here. So I think we go back to John again.
Yeah, and some of these I've covered already because I always get ahead of myself. I noted that Kansas is interesting. Of their, I think 9 system areas, they have some taxation power for their funding. There's not much state money that goes to them. There's federal money that is directed for specific projects through the systems that they do, and those change as the state works in coordination with their systems. And but the taxation power is a large part of what provides funding for continuing education and some of the technology support that they're able to provide. That's an interesting concept. It may be one that could get developed here, although having, the district library concept having been brought up twice in Wisconsin and gotten nowhere. There are very many taxing entities in Wisconsin, and I think the legislature very much resists creating new ones. So unless we could get them to eliminate town level governance or something, but once things are created, they're hard to end.
Okay, what we have in front of us, it's pretty apparent that the work of the Chapter 43 work group is in a more, I guess, reactive place than proactive. Thus far, we've provided information to the steering committee about library structures in other states to help inform their decisions on structure. But really, our work group won't be able to develop any kind of scenarios until the work group models are more finalized. As is true with the other work groups, our recommendations will go through a vetting process and may include guidance from former library leaders, an in-state review panel, partners from other states, perhaps COSLA, the chief officers of state library agencies, and others. But it's important to note that at this point, we don't really know what our vetting process will be. Going forward, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, but there is a lot of information available on the Public Library System Redesign website at plsr.info, and it includes a place for you to sign up for a blog to receive timely updates on steering committee and work group activities. It has a feedback form, so you're certainly encouraged to send your questions, concerns, suggestions there, and your ideas will then be forwarded to the steering committee and work group leadership. There's also a calendar announcing steering committee subcommittee, work group meetings, as well as regional meetings and Q&A sessions. And lastly, each work group has its own web page on this website that provide agendas for meetings, minutes of meetings, important recordings of conversations with other library leaders, and documents that are important to sharing the service models. At this point, that concludes what we wanted to share with you, and we'd like to now open it up to questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Come on, you get the microphone.
I thought there'd be all kinds of questions today.
I'll ask.
Great,
We'll get it started.
thank you.
Being the first person at the buffet line.
So you're not looking at county funding standards or director certification, you were clear on that. Are you thinking about how some of these changes could impact that? If we move further away from a county-based model. Right now, for instance, systems are county-based. If regions turn out to not be county-based or whatever we end up with, I'm just wondering if the group will be looking at that, because I don't know about other libraries, but more than 50% of my funding comes through in-county and cross-county sources. And so if those will be impacted in some way, that's an important thing to look at. So I'm just wondering if that's on the radar.
Yeah, the reason the process isn't addressing that is because even in the Joint Committee on Finance's recommendations to review public library systems in Wisconsin, they didn't reference that. There's separate parts of the statute. The county payments to libraries does not require libraries to be system members. There are payments that are conducted between the library and the county or adjacent county, although many systems do help libraries in coordinate or conduct those payments. I guess the other thing is, while systems may or services may span greater areas, I'm not so sure that, except perhaps how the hub services are done or some elements like that, or what regions personnel may address in their travel areas, counties may continue to be and should reasonably be the borderlines of systems. I'd hate to see a situation where we get into like school districts where the the lines or, well, I won't even bring up voting districts, but they provide the building blocks. I think what I've seen from other states that seems very compelling is why have the counties be the only ones appointing representatives on the boards that operate the systems or establish those services. Granted, the resource library appoints one or more positions to a system board too, but I think there could be a way to get participation of the libraries aside from the advisory board. So that's how I've been thinking about it.
Does anyone have any other questions? Steph?
Can I just follow up, because Kathy and I were talking about this before, and I just want to clarify. I just wanted to offer some reassurance from a project management's perspective on that question, because Kathy and I were talking earlier, and I think there's a difference when they're talking about we're not going to address this issue versus we're not going to be aware of this issue, right? So I feel like one of the things that the Chapter 43 work group is doing is building some expertise around areas of our laws that we need to be really thoughtful and cautious about as we move forward and make these recommendations. And I think, John are both on the steering committee and are very acutely aware of the need to make sure that we aren't damaging anything in the process of making these changes, and it's one of the steering committee's sort of principles of how they're viewing the process as a whole. So I just wanted to mention that there's a difference between these guys making recommendations to make changes to these funding formulas versus them being aware of it as we're moving forward in the process.
Yeah. And just to follow up too from what Steph said, we have sent a questionnaire to each of the 16 systems to specifically address what their relationships are with counties and how they assist their libraries working with counties, because when you're in smaller single county systems or two county systems, that relationship is much different than it is in some of the larger multi-county regional systems. And we have found so far that everybody has a slightly different relationship, and we are going to be mindful of that when we move forward.
Hi. This is possibly the most interesting group. Got a big challenge ahead. I have two things actually. One is Maine. Have you heard about Maine? They went from, I think it was 3 districts to 9 regional support districts. So they're actually a system that expanded. And I think they've got a completely different model than we do, but it might be one to look at where expansion was what was deemed necessary. I'm not suggesting we do that, but it's kind of the opposite story of what you've been looking at. The other is, are there any LD and L people in here? Okay. I've been hearing a lot how this process started when there was kind of a fear of system mergers, but more recently, LD and L worked really hard to get additional funding for systems, and it's a big success story. And there have been some mergers happening kind of more organically. So one thing that comes up is it really going to, does it make sense to change Chapter 43 at this time? And I could see it going both ways. One is there's a good feeling in the legislature, and if it's a positive thing, yes. But if it's less of a positive thing, that it could actually maybe hurt the great feeling in the legislature. So I don't want to speak for those folks, but I've had a lot of discussions along those lines lately.
So we are aware of Maine, and I think that's one of the things that we've been looking at. We just highlighted some of the examples. There's a whole host of states that we've looked at. The other piece, in terms of Chapter 43 revisions, one of the things that we're going to be looking at as we get more into the process, and this is probably more of a steering committee comment than a Chapter 43 work group comment, but we're going to be working with the library community once the work group report has been handed off to have stakeholders work with us to help build that governance structure, that administrative structure. And we're going to really look at what can we do now given our existing structure within Chapter 43. What can we do that might require just some slight tweaks? are there things that we may need to do a bigger revision, and that's going to take a longer period of time because it's a political process. But I think, speaking as the steering committee chair, what we're really looking at in this project is, are we using the state dollars that we receive to the best of our ability to provide the best and most equitable service to every library in the state of Wisconsin? So with the framework and those contexts, we're going to try to look at Chapter 43, look at the other models and say, okay, is this what works best? Can we achieve it? Or will we need to stage it? So there's a lot of things that are going to come into this project as we move forward.
And I think those of you that have been in the other sessions would agree is that equity comes up a lot, and that's an important thing to, I think, all of the groups. So as we're looking at Chapter 43, is something too broad? Is that the reason why things are not equitable? Does it need to be narrowed? It doesn't necessarily mean changing it a lot. It could be something that's very subtle as far as what we need to provide equitable service in each one of the service areas. Is it the way that it exists now? Can we do things this way without having to change it? And that's what John is referring to. I think one of the things that maybe you can step away from this session with is that we're not necessarily going to change everything that's up there. What we need to do is look at the reports back that we get from the other work groups and say, okay, if this is what you want, then this probably needs to change. Or if this is what you want, then we really don't need to change this statute because it's close enough to what it is that you want to do. But maybe it needs to be tweaked a little and say, rather than may, say should. And it may just be one word that's within a statute.
Does anyone else have any other questions or comments? Okay.
Accountability is such a huge piece of this. Are you expecting that accountability will be included in work group recommendations, or that will be handled more by your committee?
I think the accountability piece will be more part of the governance and administration piece. It is one of the principles of the structure we're kind of looking at, being accountable to the libraries that receive the service. So it'll be part of that stakeholder discussion. We're also looking at having some discussions with library directors coming up in the next month or two to kind of address some of what types of things do library directors want to see for accountability for services. So we're going to continue to build some of that feedback in.
Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, Bruce.
There will be some of that in the work group recommendations, because we are asking them to give some parameters of what their thoughts are on governance. Specifically, I know with some of the work groups I'm working with, it's what do they think is the type of oversight that's needed to make sure it's accountable to those they serve, the libraries, but also accountable to evolve as changes happen. What is needed for that? So those are just kind of general recommendations to allow steering to have an idea from each work group what they think might be needed for their area.
Thank you. Anyone else? Josh?
Not looking for specifics, I'm just curious in general, in the abstract, with all the other work groups and as far as they've come in what we know so far now, have you guys seen any of that work look to pressure the existing statutes in obvious ways? Like, we know we're going to have to address something here, but we don't know what it looks like yet. That's basically the question.
I don't think that we've seen anything so far that would, like you said, would put pressure on what we're looking at. I think because of what we're doing, we still need to wait until it's something that they're definitely recommending. You know, if we're just looking at the ideas they have right now, I mean, that would be a lot of pressure because we'd have to say, well, if you do that, then we're gonna have to do this, but if you do that, we're gonna have to do that. So that's one of the reasons why we're sort of holding back and waiting. But once the recommendations start coming, we're gonna be pretty busy. And, you know, things are gonna pick up. But right now, there's not a whole lot of pressure because so many of the groups are just still in the stage of this is what we think should happen.
Anyone else? Oh, is it time?
It's time.
Oh, one more question?
I was just wondering if you had a goal in terms of timeline. I know a lot of it hinges on other work groups, but.
In my lifetime.
I think she was referring to the chapter 43 work, John.
Oh, okay.
Again, we're monitoring what's going on in the work group, so when they give some information in February that's a little bit more refined, we'll have the ability to use that information and see what might or may not fit within the structure of chapter 43. Really, a lot of the research is just giving us ideas of what could be possible within statute and what exists there now. There are provisions in statutes that allow for contracting. There's provisions that allow for systems to develop services that are a benefit to their member libraries. So there are pieces that are flexible in there, while there's other pieces that are a little bit more constrictive. So we're going to work within all that when we get those reports. But the members of the work group have a lot of expertise for a long time, I won't say how many decades, that the familiarity is there with the work group members.
Okay, our session is over, but if you have any questions, concerns, issues at any time, please feel free to contact our work group with your views. Thank you.